He had already lost everything that once made life feel steady: his home, his marriage, his job, and slowly, even the will to keep going. Now, a homeless veteran slept in the front seat of an old truck with only his loyal dog beside him and $150 left to his name. On a quiet winter night, as light snow fell, the dog suddenly stopped, staring toward a rusted houseboat at the end of an empty river dock. No one wanted it. No one had touched it in years, but the dog refused to walk away. What they found inside that broken boat was left behind by another veteran fighting his own silent war. And what happened next may remind you that sometimes the answers we're searching for are hidden in the places everyone else has given up on. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? The night settled over a small Minnesota town where light snow drifted steadily through the air, soft enough to quiet the world without hiding it. A small church stood at the edge of the road, its warm light fading just before it reached the empty parking lot behind it. Samuel Reed slept in the cab of an aging pickup truck, parked in the far corner of that lot, where the shadows were thick enough to keep him unnoticed. The truck had once been dark blue, but time and weather had stripped it down to something dull and uneven. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of cold fabric and metal, the kind of space never meant to hold a life, but now did. He slept lightly, always had since the war. One arm was tucked beneath his head, the other resting against the steady warmth beside him. Cooper lay pressed against his chest, a German shepherd in his prime, 5 years old, strong, alert even in stillness. His black saddle coat was thick against the cold, his amber eyes opening before Samuel's ever did. Cooper didn't just sleep next to him, he watched over him. Samuel awoke suddenly, not slowly, not gently. His body tightened before his mind caught up, breath pulling in sharp as if he had been dropped into the moment instead of waking into it. For a second, the truck wasn't a truck. The silence wasn't safe. A distant metallic sound lingered in his head, something his body remembered even when the world around him didn't. Then Cooper shifted, just enough. The dog leaned into him, grounding him without urgency, without panic. Samuel's hand found the thick fur at his neck, fingers tightening slightly, holding on to something real. The tension didn't disappear. It never did. But it loosened enough for him to breathe again. "Yeah, I know," Samuel murmured, voice low and rough. Cooper stayed still, calm as ever. Samuel pushed himself upright, careful not to hit the roof of the cab. He moved the same way he always did in the mornings, quiet, controlled, deliberate. No wasted motion, no noise he didn't intend to make. He wiped the inside of the windshield with a folded cloth, clearing the thin layer of condensation until the outside came back into focus. The parking lot was empty. Fresh snow had softened everything. Even the tire tracks from the night before were already fading, like the world was slowly covering its own history. Samuel checked his watch. Still early, good. He preferred the hour before people started moving. Not because he was hiding, he told himself that wasn't it, but because fewer people meant fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer moments where he had to pretend he belonged somewhere he didn't. He stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into the thin snow with a quiet crunch. The cold hit him immediately, sharp but clean, the kind that made you aware of every breath. His clothes were simple but cared for, a brown jacket worn at the seams, clean jeans, boots that had seen years but were still kept in working condition. He didn't let himself fall apart, not completely. Cooper jumped down beside him, landing with controlled weight, then paused. His ears lifted slightly as he scanned the lot, checking, always checking. Only after a moment did he relax. Across the lot, the church door opened. Margaret Collins stepped out, carrying a small metal bucket in one hand. She was a woman in her late 60s, her posture steady, her movements unhurried. Her silver hair was cut short, her face lined not by age alone, but by years of understanding more than she said. "Morning, Samuel." Her voice was gentle, but it carried clearly in the cold air. "Morning," he replied. She didn't ask why he was there, never had. Instead, she walked over and set the bucket down near the steps. Inside were a few wrapped sandwiches and a thermos. "It's going to be colder tonight," she said, glancing briefly at the sky. Kind that settles in your bones. Samuel stepped forward and picked up the thermos. It was still warm. Thank you. Margaret's eyes shifted to Cooper, who sat quietly at Samuel's side. He doesn't leave you, she said. Samuel glanced down. No, he doesn't. She studied him for a moment, longer than most people did. My husband used to wake like that, she said quietly, long after he came back. Samuel didn't respond, not because he didn't hear her, because he did. And that was enough. Margaret gave a small nod, as if that silence told her what she needed to know, then turned and walked back inside. Samuel stood there a moment longer, the warmth of the thermos steady in his hands. He had once been a man people relied on, a man who showed up when something broke, especially in winter. Heating systems, wiring, small things that mattered when they stopped working. He had built a life on being useful, on being steady. Claire had loved that about him. She had been patient, more patient than most. A woman with soft brown hair, steady eyes, and a voice that never rushed him. She used to stand in the doorway, waiting for him to say something real. You don't have to carry it alone, she had told him once. He had nodded. He always nodded. But the words never came, not the memories, not the weight, not the things that woke him in the middle of the night with his heart already racing. The day she left, she didn't slam the door. She closed it gently. Like she understood something in him had already been lost long before she walked away. Samuel poured a small amount of coffee into the lid and set it down. Cooper drank first, slow and careful, then looked back at him. Samuel gave a faint, tired smile. Yeah, you first. He ate in silence, the snow continuing to fall in soft, steady patterns around him. The day ahead wasn't much different from the ones before it. Work, if he could find it. A place to stand. A way to get through. That had been enough for a while, but this morning felt different. Not better, just different. Cooper lifted his head, his ears angled forward, his body still, his focus fixed beyond the far edge of the lot, toward the direction where the trees opened near the river. Samuel followed his gaze. You see something? Cooper didn't bark, didn't move. He just watched. And something in that stillness felt intentional. Samuel narrowed his eyes slightly, looking in the same direction. For a moment, he almost dismissed it, almost turned away. But he didn't. Because for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something waiting. By mid-morning, Samuel Reed had found work at the river dock, and that alone made the day feel worth standing through. The job came from a crooked paper notice taped to a gas station window. Dock cleanup. Cash paid daily. Ask for Rick. It was the kind of work that did not care where a man had slept the night before. It only cared whether he could lift, carry, sort, and keep moving. The dock sat beyond the last row of houses, where the road turned to gravel and the river widened behind a line of bare cottonwoods. Light snow moved across the water in thin white threads, never heavy enough to cover the world, only enough to make every surface look colder. Storage sheds leaned along the bank with dented doors and rusted locks, and the wooden planks of the dock were dark with moisture. The river itself kept moving, slow and gray, carrying the reflection of the sky without complaint. Samuel worked with his jacket zipped high and his gloves pulled tight. He hauled broken crates from one shed, stacked rotted boards behind another, and carried old coils of rope stiffened by years of damp weather. The labor was hard, but there was mercy in work that had shape. A crate needed lifting, a floor needed sweeping, a pile needed sorting. Unlike memory, it stayed where he put it. Cooper stayed near him, not underfoot, never careless. The German shepherd moved like a quiet shadow at Samuel's side, occasionally sniffing the edge of a shed or watching the river, but always returning to where Samuel could see him. Every so often, though, Cooper's attention drifted past the last storage shed toward the far end of the dock. He would stand still, ears slightly forward, body calm but fixed, as if something down there had asked for him without making a sound. Samuel noticed it the third time. "What are you looking at?" he asked quietly. Cooper did not answer, of course. He only kept watching. That was when Samuel saw the houseboat. It sat beyond the last set of pilings, tied loosely to the dock by two weathered lines. At first glance, it looked like something the river had forgotten to finish taking. The hull was steel, rusted in long reddish streaks, but it still sat level in the water. The cabin was low and square, its old white paint faded nearly gray, its windows clouded by age and damp. A narrow railing ran along the deck, bent in one place but still holding. Nothing about it looked fine, yet nothing about it looked finished either. It did not look abandoned in the way empty things usually did. It looked as if someone had left it carefully, hoping it would be understood later. "You got an eye for lost causes?" The voice came from behind Samuel, dry but not unfriendly. Samuel turned and saw Rick Halverson walking toward him, with both hands tucked deep into the pockets of a heavy canvas coat. Rick was in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders, with a thick gray beard trimmed close along a square jaw. His cheeks were red from wind, and his eyes were pale blue, sharp from a lifetime of judging weather, tools, and people quickly. He had the manner of a man who did not waste words because most of his life had been spent around machines, water, and men who understood plain speech. "Just noticed it," Samuel said. Rick looked toward the houseboat and gave a small grunt. "Hard not to. Been sitting there almost a year." "Whose was it?" "Harold Bennett's." Rick said the name with a kind of rough respect, as if the dead man still had a place on the dock. "Old Navy man? Lived aboard her longer than some folks stay married. Kept to himself mostly. Paid on time, fixed what he could, never asked for much." Samuel looked back at the boat. The mention of Navy did not pass through him cleanly. It caught somewhere inside. "He passed?" Samuel asked. "Last winter. Hospital called me because my number was in his papers. No wife, no kids, nobody came asking after the boat." Rick shifted his weight, eyes still on the hull. "After a while, people stop asking questions. Things just sit." Samuel said nothing. Cooper took one step closer to the dock's far edge, then stopped again. Rick noticed. "Dog likes her. Seems that way. Dogs usually know what people pretend not to." Samuel glanced at him, but Rick had already turned back toward the sheds. "Come on. Still got half a shed to clear if you want the day's pay." Samuel returned to the work, but the rhythm did not settle the same way after that. His hands kept moving, but his mind kept drifting toward the houseboat. Harold Bennett, Navy man, lived aboard longer than some folks stay married. The words stayed with him, not because they explained anything, but because they opened a small door he had not expected. By late afternoon, Rick handed Samuel $60 in folded bills for the day's work. Samuel accepted it with a nod, tucking it carefully into his wallet. Before he could turn toward the truck, Cooper moved, not fast, not wild, just certain. The dog walked past Samuel, past Rick, and onto the narrow stretch of dock that led toward the houseboat. His paws made almost no sound on the damp boards. He did not look back until he reached the short walkway leading onto the boat. Samuel felt Rick watching him. "He does that often?" Rick asked. "Not unless he means it." The two men walked after him. The dock creaked under their boots, and the river made a low, steady sound against the hull. Up close, the boat showed its age honestly, rust along the seams, a cracked corner on one window, a door swollen from moisture, but the deck boards were not collapsing, and the cabin frame still stood square. Rick leaned against a piling. "She owes dock fees." Samuel kept his eyes on the boat. "How much?" $150. Samuel turned then. "That's all?" "That's all anyone cares to collect." Rick scratched at his beard. "Scrap guy offered to haul her off, but I didn't like the way he talked about her. Harold kept this boat alive too long for somebody to cut her up before she gets one fair chance." Samuel reached into his pocket before he fully decided to. His wallet felt thin, even after the day's pay. He opened it slowly and counted the bills inside. $163. The number landed hard. It was gas. Food. A little room between him and nothing. It was the difference between one bad week and a worse one. His mind began doing what it had learned to do: measure risk, count exits, prepare for regret. Every sensible part of him said to put the wallet away. Then Cooper stepped onto the boat. Only one step. Then he turned and looked back. Samuel did not hear a command in it. He did not believe in that kind of thing. But he knew his dog. Cooper had pulled him out of nightmares, warned him away from panic before it reached his throat, and stayed close on nights when Samuel could not trust his own thoughts. If Cooper was asking him to look closer, Samuel had learned not to ignore it. He counted out $150 and held it toward Rick. "I'll take her." Rick looked at the money, then at Samuel's face. "You understand she needs work." "I know." "Maybe more than she's worth." Samuel looked at the rusted hull, the dim windows, the bent railing. Then he looked at Cooper standing steady on the deck. "Maybe not." Rick studied him a moment longer, and something in his expression softened, just enough to be seen. He took the money, counted it once, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key darkened with age. "Door sticks," he said, placing it in Samuel's palm. "Push low, not high, and watch the step inside." There was no ceremony after that. No handshake meant to make the moment bigger than it was. Rick simply nodded, turned back toward the sheds, and left Samuel standing with a key in his hand and $13 in his wallet. The sky dimmed early, as winter skies do, fading from gray to blue-black while snow continued to fall in thin, patient lines. Samuel stood at the edge of the dock for several minutes before stepping onto the boat. The deck flexed faintly beneath his weight, but held. Cooper moved ahead of him, calm now, as if the decision had already settled something. The key resisted in the lock. Samuel worked it gently, unwilling to force the old metal, then pressed his shoulder against the door the way Rick had told him. The door scraped open with a tired groan. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and river damp, but not rot. That mattered. The space was small, barely more than a single room, with a narrow bunk along one wall, a fixed table near the window, and a compact stove set into the corner. There were stains on the floor, peeling paint around the trim, and cobwebs tucked in the upper corners, but the room still held its shape. Someone had once known how to live here carefully. Cooper moved slowly through the cabin, nose low, reading the place in ways Samuel never could. He sniffed the bunks, the stove, the base of the table. Then he stopped at an old chair against the far wall. The fabric had faded to a tired brown, but it was not torn. Cooper sniffed it once, circled it, and lay down beside it with his head resting between his paws. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching. There were no lights on, no heat, no promise that tomorrow would be easier, but the wind outside sounded different through these walls than it had against the truck windows. Less like something trying to get in, more like something passing by. Samuel stepped fully into the cabin and closed the door behind him. The latch caught. For the first time in months, he was not just inside something. He was inside something that was his. He sat on the edge of the bunk with the brass key still in his hand. Cooper looked up from beside the chair, amber eyes steady in the dim light. Samuel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "It's not much," he said. The old boat rocked gently beneath him, answering only with the river. Samuel looked around the cabin, at the worn table, the narrow stove, the chair Cooper had chosen, and the small window where snow slid quietly through the darkness outside. Then he nodded once, almost to himself. "But it's more than we had." Morning came gray and quiet over the river, the kind of winter light that did not brighten the world, so much as reveal it slowly. Snow moved past the cabin windows in fine, restless streaks, and the old houseboat shifted once or twice against its lines, not enough to unsettle the room, only enough to remind Samuel Reed that he had slept on water and woken in a place that, for the first time in a long while, did not feel borrowed. He rose early out of habit, pulling on his boots before the cold in the cabin had fully reached his bones. Cooper was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the old chair by the far wall, ears relaxed but attentive, his dark body still except for the slow turn of his head as Samuel moved about the room. He had spent most of the night there, not guarding the door, not pacing the floor, just staying near that chair as though some trace of the man who once sat in it had not entirely faded. Samuel opened the small window over the table and let in the cold air. The cabin needed clearing before it needed fixing. That much he understood. He found an empty trash sack in the truck, brought it in, and began with the obvious things. Stained paper cups, broken pens, stiff newspapers, a cracked plastic dish, a rusted can opener, old receipts swollen from damp. He worked without hurry. The room was small, and every object he moved seemed to reveal another beneath it. Dust lifted into the pale light. Floorboards showed where the table legs had rubbed them smooth over the years. The space felt less abandoned in daylight than it had the night before. Not cleaner, not kinder, just more personal. Cooper followed the cleaning for a while, pacing once around the bunk and table, then returning to the chair. He sniffed the worn armrest, lowered his head, and lay down beside it with a quiet certainty that kept drawing Samuel's eye. There were plenty of places in the cabin where a dog could have settled. Cooper chose that one every time. "You're telling me something?" Samuel said, half to the dog and half to the room itself. He turned to the fixed table by the window. One drawer sat crooked in its frame, swollen enough that it had not likely opened easily in some time. Samuel braced one hand against the table and worked the drawer loose with the other. It gave in short pulls, then slid open all at once with a dry wooden scrape. Inside was not treasure, not at first glance. It was the ordinary inventory of a narrow life. A pocket flashlight wrapped with electrical tape near the switch. A folding knife dulled by years of use. 3 pencils, each sharpened with a blade rather than a machine. A cracked pair of reading glasses in a soft case. A spool of twine. A brass lighter that no longer sparked. Beneath those things, arranged more neatly than anything else in the drawer, was a handkerchief wrapped around several small objects. Samuel unfolded the cloth with care. A navy insignia lay inside, tarnished at the edges but still distinct. Between it were 2 service ribbons, a pair of collar pins, and a photograph worn soft at the corners. Samuel lifted the photograph first. The man in it had Harold Bennett's face, though younger than Samuel would have guessed. Lean, long-faced, and weathered even then, Harold stood on this same boat in a dark wool coat with one hand resting on the railing. His hair had already gone mostly silver, cut short, and a trimmed gray mustache framed a mouth that seemed more used to restraint than ease. He was not smiling, but he did not look hard either. Beside him sat an old hound with heavy ears and a pale muzzle, the kind of dog that had likely stayed through more silence than conversation. Samuel studied the picture longer than he meant to. There was something in Harold's posture that he recognized immediately. The squared shoulders, the contained stillness, the expression of a man standing in one place while listening to something far away. Cooper came forward and sniffed at the edge of the photograph, then looked back toward the chair. Samuel followed his gaze. The chair, the dog, the photo. Small things, but they were beginning to fit together. In the cabinet beside the bunk, Samuel found a different kind of order. Someone had folded things there with care. A pair of leather gloves sat thumb to thumb, the fingertips worn pale from work. A rain poncho was rolled tight beside them. Beneath that, tucked against the back wall, stood a faded pill bottle with a military pharmacy label, barely readable under the dust. The bottle was empty, but Samuel did not need to see the name on it to understand what kind of knights it had belonged to. He set it on the bunk and continued searching. At the bottom of the cabinet were 2 manuals on marine engines, a paperback collection of poems with a split spine, and a small black notebook. The notebook was plain enough to be overlooked, and for a moment Samuel almost put it back where he found it. The cabin already carried enough of Harold's private life in its air. It felt wrong to lift the cover of something so plainly kept for the dark hours. But then he looked around the room again. The old chair, the carefully folded gloves, the hound in the photograph, the empty medicine bottle, and the hesitation changed shape. This was no longer curiosity. It was recognition. He opened the notebook. The first pages were practical. Fuel levels, repair lists, tides, short notes about weather and engine noise. Then the entries became sparse. The handwriting tightened. Whole pages held only times. 1:12 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:05 a.m. A few pages later, on an otherwise blank sheet, Harold had written a single word. Again. Samuel did not turn the page right away. He sat on the edge of the bunk with the notebook in his hands and stared at that word until the cabin around him seemed to quiet itself in respect. Again, not dramatic, not self-pitying, just exact. One word for the return of something a man never invited and never fully escaped. He kept reading, couldn't breathe. Rain on roof sounded wrong. Forgot where I was. Dog stayed. Samuel shut the notebook halfway and pressed his thumb between the pages. He knew those sentences too well to need any more of them. Not those exact nights, maybe. Not those exact sounds. But the structure of them, yes. The body waking before the mind. The room becoming another room. The shame afterward, when morning came and the walls looked ordinary again. Cooper crossed the cabin and stood in front of him. When Samuel lowered his hand, the dog rested his muzzle against his knee. "Yeah," Samuel said quietly, "I know." He did not realize until then that his breathing had shortened. The revelation was not that Harold had suffered. Samuel had guessed as much the moment he saw the old military bottle, the gloves, the discipline in the room. The revelation was simpler and heavier than that. Harold had suffered here, in this same cabin, in this same cold light, in the same hourless stretch between midnight and dawn, when a man could feel most alone in the world. Samuel placed the notebook on the table beside the Navy insignia and photograph. After that, the cleaning changed. He no longer moved through the cabin as if he were sorting through leftovers in a place he happened to own. He handled each object as if it belonged to a man who had held himself together in private and left behind only what his hands could not carry. He wiped the reading glasses clean and laid them beside the photo. He folded the gloves again after checking the lining. He stacked the manuals neatly. He kept the book of poems, and when it fell open in his hand, he found a single line underlined in pencil. "Some days the water is the only thing that answers without asking." That line stayed with him. By noon, the cabin was still rough, but no longer shapeless. Trash sat bagged by the door. Loose papers were sorted. Harold's belongings occupied one clean section of the table, as if waiting to be understood rather than thrown away. Cooper remained beside the chair, lifting his head now and then to watch Samuel move from stove to bunk to shelf, always calm, always present. Samuel stood in the center of the room and looked at what he had done. He had come onto the boat hoping for a roof that floated, a place to get through the cold without breaking further apart. That had seemed like enough. But sometime during the morning, without his permission or even his notice, the task had become something else. Not rescue, not redemption, something quieter and more binding than both. He was not just cleaning a boat. He was handling the remains of another soldier's unfinished life. That knowledge settled into him with the force of truth, not sentiment. Harold Bennett was no longer just the dead owner Rick had mentioned in passing. He had become a presence in the room, not ghostly, not imagined, but real in the only way the dead remain real, through the shape of what they touched, what they endured, and what they left in their wake for someone else to find. Samuel picked up the Navy insignia again and turned it once between his fingers. The metal had been rubbed smooth in places, as if Harold had held it often, perhaps on nights when sleep would not come. Samuel thought of the notebook, the single word, the line about the dog staying. He thought of his own nights in the truck, the old panic, the false starts, the way Cooper had pressed against him until he could breathe like a man in a room instead of a man under fire. "One soldier to another," he said softly. Cooper raised his head from beside the chair. Samuel set the insignia down and looked around the cabin once more. The work ahead was still there: repairs, cleaning, questions. But now there was a steadier reason for doing it. When he bent to lift the next box from beneath the table, he did so with both hands and a different kind of care. By the next morning, Samuel Reed had stopped thinking of the cabin as a mystery and started treating it like a structure that needed to be understood. That was the only way he knew how to keep fear from turning into superstition. If a board felt weak, there was a reason. If a pipe leaked, there was a source. If something had survived this long, it had done so because someone had made practical choices before him. The weather had sharpened overnight. Light snow still drifted over the river, but the wind carried a harder edge now, pressing against the cabin walls in thin, steady gusts. Inside, the stove remained cold. The window glass clouded faintly at the corners, and the floor near the small sink held the same dark stains Samuel had noticed the day before. The boards there felt soft under his boot, not dangerously soft yet, but wrong enough that he could not ignore them. He set a toolbox beside the stove and knelt. Cooper watched from the old chair for a while before coming over. The German Shepherd moved with the same quiet alertness he brought to everything on the boat. He did not crowd Samuel or whine for attention. He simply stood close enough to see what was happening, his ears lifting slightly whenever Samuel shifted a board or laid down a tool. Samuel loosened the rusted clamp beneath the sink first, then tested the narrow pipe with 2 fingers. It wobbled more than it should have, a slow leak over years, maybe. Enough to stain the wood, enough to soften it. He worked carefully, removing the warped trim and prying at the first narrow board nearest the stove. The wood lifted in splinters and dust, releasing the stale smell of trapped damp. Beneath it ran part of the old plumbing line and a shallow gap where moisture had gathered more than once. "All right," he murmured. "That's one problem." He reached for the flashlight. Before he could switch it on, Cooper scratched sharply at the floor to his right. Not once, not casually, again. Samuel turned immediately. The dog had planted one paw on a darker corner board near the wall and was raking at it in short, focused strokes. The sound was different from before, hollower, less like surface wood and more like something laid over empty space. "Hold on," Samuel said, shifting closer. Cooper stopped, but only because Samuel put a hand on his shoulder. The dog's attention never left that corner. Samuel ran his palm along the grain and found what his eye had missed at first, a seam too clean to be accidental. Not wide, not obvious, but straight. It had been painted over more than once and dirt had settled into it, but now that he saw it, he could not unsee it. Whoever built it had meant for it to disappear into the rest of the floor. Samuel wedged the flat end of the pry bar into the seam and lifted gently. The board resisted. He adjusted the angle and tried again. This time the edge came free with a dry, fibrous crack, and the section rose just enough for him to grip it. Another board beside it lifted more easily. Together they revealed a narrow waterproofed compartment built between the floor supports and sealed with old tar-black lining along the inside. Something sat in it, a military chest. Samuel drew in a slow breath and said nothing for several seconds. The chest was rectangular and compact, the size a man might use to store documents, cash, and the last things he did not trust to any other place. The paint, once olive drab, had darkened with age. Brass corners had gone almost brown. The leather handle was cracked, but intact. No decorative marks, no attempt to make it beautiful, only durable. Cooper lowered his muzzle toward the opening and sniffed once, then looked back at Samuel as if to confirm that this, and not the pipe, had been the real point. Samuel set the flashlight beside him, slipped both hands under the chest, and lifted. It was heavier than he expected. He had to brace one knee against the floor and pull it up carefully before setting it on the open section of boards beside the stove. The sound it made when it landed was dense and final. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Harold had hidden it under the place most likely to be repaired only by necessity, not curiosity. That alone told Samuel something about the old man's mind. He had not built this compartment for convenience. He had built it for time. Samuel checked the front. No padlock, just 2 latches, stiff with age. He pressed one, then the other. The first opened reluctantly. The second needed the tip of a screwdriver before it snapped up with a metallic click. He lifted the lid. Inside, everything had been wrapped against years. Bundles of cash lay in neat rows, each stack enclosed in waxed paper and tied with plain string. The wrapping had yellowed, but remained sealed. Beside them sat canvas bags heavy enough to suggest coin rather than paper. Beneath those lay a packet of old savings bonds, a folded American flag tucked flat along one side, a waterproof sleeve containing the boat's title and registration papers, and 2 handwritten envelopes, one resting on top of the documents, the other tied to a separate bundle of money. Samuel did not touch anything for a full second. Then training of a different kind took over. The training of a man who had spent years keeping his hands steady when surprise could ruin the work. He lifted one wax-wrapped bundle, turned it over, then set it down again. Money. Real money. More than he had seen in one place in years. Enough of it that he forced himself not to guess. He counted, not because he wanted to, because counting gave a shape to shock. Bundle after bundle, laid into ordered stacks across the cleared part of the floor. He counted once, then again more carefully, in case numbness had fooled him. $62,400. He sat back on his heels and stared at the rows spread before him. The silver coins and bonds took longer. Samuel opened one of the canvas bags and found old dollars and half-dollars dulled by age but heavy in the hand. He sorted dates, checked mint marks where he could, and made the best estimate available to a man without a dealer's desk in front of him. Between the coins and the bonds, the value was roughly 18,000 more. He did not smile. He did not thank God. He did not laugh at the impossible turn of it. His first feeling was fear, not the sudden combat kind, the narrower kind, the kind that came when a thing could change a life too quickly. Who knew? Who might find out? Had Rick suspected? Had anyone ever seen Harold hide this? What happened to men like him when other people smelled money before they smelled weakness? His breathing shortened. Cooper stepped forward at once and leaned against his leg. Samuel dropped one hand to the dog's neck, fingers knotting into thick fur until the rush in his chest eased enough for him to think again. "Stay," he said quietly. Cooper did. Samuel looked back into the chest and noticed the second envelope more clearly now. It was tied with a piece of string around a separate bundle, $8,000 kept apart from the rest, as if Harold had not wanted it confused with savings. Samuel untied the first loose envelope instead and unfolded it with care. The handwriting was tight, upright, familiar from the notebook. If you're reading this, you're probably still trying to stay alive. I understand that. Make this place a second chance, the way I once did. Samuel lowered the page halfway and read it again. There was no self-pity in the words, no grand explanation. Harold had written like a man speaking to someone he expected would already understand the important part. Samuel looked at the old chair by the wall, then at the notebook on the table, then at the folded flag in the chest. One soldier to another. He reached for the second envelope and untied it from the separate cash bundle. If you can, make the boat run again. She listened to me longer than any person ever did. She may listen to you for a long time too. Pay her back. She has a soul. This time Samuel sat down on the floor, rather than risk his knees giving way under him. The $8,000 lay in his lap. The letter rested in one hand. Cooper stood beside him, not demanding, not anxious, only present. And suddenly the arrangement of everything made sense. Harold had not failed to spend his money. He had chosen not to spend it in ways that would draw eyes. If he had rebuilt the boat too beautifully, hired too many people, bragged or flashed, or let the wrong man smell fresh money on an old hull, the houseboat would have stopped being refuge and started being target. So he had kept her plain, repair enough to live, never enough to invite attention. The chest was not miserliness, it was camouflage. Samuel looked around the cabin with new understanding. Harold had hidden his savings the same way he had hidden his suffering, under order, under routine, under enough silence to keep the world from interfering. And yet he had still prepared for the possibility that someone would come after him who needed more than money, a place, a chance, a boat that could listen. Samuel set both letters on the table beside the Navy insignia, the photograph, and Harold's cleaned glasses. Then he lifted the folded flag from the chest with both hands and laid it above the documents. He did not open it. He would not. Some things demanded respect before explanation. The title papers were old but complete. Registration records, maintenance notes, ownership transfers never fully updated after Harold's death. Enough paperwork to tell Samuel that the boat had not been left in chaos. Harold had not trusted chance. He had left a trail for a man willing to follow it carefully. By afternoon, the floor around the stove remained open, the removed boards stacked neatly by the wall. The chest sat closed beneath the table now, no longer hidden under the floor, but still out of sight from any casual visitor. Samuel had put the bulk of the cash and coins back inside. Only the separate $8,000 bundle and the paperwork remained out. He knew, even then, that he could not speak of this lightly. Money changed the meaning of a man in other people's minds. It made them kinder, meaner, closer, suspicious, sometimes all at once. A man sleeping in a truck could be ignored. A man with hidden money could become a story. Samuel had no interest in becoming one, but silence was not the same thing as refusal. He rested a hand on the separate bundle and looked at the dead stove, the soft floor by the pipe, the walls that still needed sealing, the boat that floated but did not yet run. Harold had not handed him ease. He had handed him work with a future inside it. Samuel glanced at Cooper. The dog had stretched out near the old chair again, his head up, eyes tracking Samuel in the quiet way that had become more than companionship. He had found the compartment. He had stayed. He had, in the simplest possible form, delivered Harold's final trust into the hands of a man able to read it. Samuel looked toward the window where the snow had begun again, thin and steady over the river. "You should have asked for less," he said softly. The houseboat rocked once against its lines, not an answer exactly, but close enough that the room seemed to hold the words. Samuel reached for the first board he had removed from the floor. There was still work to do, and now he knew why. That night, the money did not make Samuel Reed feel safe. It made him feel awake. He had hidden the chest again as carefully as he could, returned the loose boards to their place well enough to avoid drawing attention, and set Harold Bennett's letters beneath the Old Navy insignia on the table where he could see them if he looked. Then he sat for a long time on the edge of the bunk with both hands clasped between his knees, listening to the river tap against the hull and the wind press along the seams of the boat. Everything practical had changed. He knew that. He no longer stood one missed paycheck away from sleeping in a freezing truck until the engine failed or the weather finished the argument for him. He could buy lumber. He could replace the pipe. He could seal the walls, paint the hull, maybe even begin thinking about the engine Harold had asked him to bring back to life. But none of that reached the oldest part of him. Money could solve exposure. It could not quiet vigilance. It could buy time. It could not persuade his body that the night was not a threat. He tried to sleep anyway. The cabin was darker than the truck had ever been. The boat moved only slightly in its slip, a slow, almost thoughtful rocking. Cooper lay at first near the old chair, then closer to the bunk when Samuel stretched out, as if the dog had already judged the night, and did not trust it much either. Samuel closed his eyes and counted breaths until the numbers lost their shape. When sleep finally took him, it did not stay gentle. He came awake all at once, one hard gasp, his chest locked tight, his shirt damp with cold sweat, his heart pounding as if the room were full of noise instead of silence. For a split second, he did not know where he was. Not on the boat, not in Minnesota, not in the present. The old chaos was back in his body before his mind could argue with it. Then Cooper was there. The German Shepherd came up against the bunk in one fluid motion, front paws braced, chest pressed into Samuel's ribs with steady, unmistakable weight. Samuel gripped the fur at the base of Cooper's neck and bent toward him, forehead nearly against the dog's shoulder. Cooper did not fidget. He did not whine. He only stayed there, breathing slowly enough for two. "Stay," Samuel whispered. Cooper stayed. The panic did not vanish. It thinned. It let air back in. It loosened just enough for the walls to become walls again, and the dark to become a room instead of a memory. Samuel sat like that for a while, one hand in the dog's fur, the other braced against the bunk, until the pounding in his chest settled into something his body could live with. Outside, snow brushed softly past the window. Inside, the boat held. When morning came, Samuel felt wrung out rather than rested, but exhaustion had a way of clarifying what fear tried to blur. Harold had left him money. Harold had also left him work. If Samuel wanted this place to become anything more than a floating shelter with hidden cash beneath the floorboards, he had to begin with the simplest possible step. He made a list. Rust converter, marine primer, basic hardware, pipe sealant, new fasteners, gloves, a pry bar small enough for the floor. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make a clerk wonder why a man fixing one old boat needed the inventory of a shipyard. He took only a modest amount of money from the chest and wrapped it in a worn receipt envelope before sliding it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The rest stayed hidden. Then he drove into town with Cooper beside him and the list folded twice in his shirt pocket. The marine supply store stood near the highway just beyond the feed mill, a low, rectangular building with blue trim that had once been cheerful and now was simply weathered. The front window held coils of rope, bilge pumps, sealants, and storm lanterns arranged with more practicality than charm. Inside, the place smelled of oil, wet canvas, rubber, and old pine shelves. A a smell Samuel recognized from another life, one in which men still called him because they trusted his hands. He stood just inside the door for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Cooper remained near the entrance, calm and watchful. Behind the counter was a young cashier named Megan, according to the tag pinned to her fleece vest. She looked about 24, maybe 25, with tired, pale skin and dark blonde hair twisted into a loose knot that kept slipping toward one shoulder. Her face had a guarded prettiness to it, the kind that had learned not to relax too quickly around strangers. She moved efficiently, but kept a quiet distance from everyone, as if she had grown up around the sort of disorder that taught a person to see trouble before it announced itself. Samuel nodded politely and moved through the aisles. He chose what he needed slowly, checking sizes and labels twice. Two older men stood near the back wall studying outboard parts and arguing softly about prop pitch. One was tall and stooped, with a red knit cap and a beard yellowed near the mouth by years of coffee and weather. The other was shorter, thick through the middle, with the heavy-lidded expression of a man who expected disappointment from most things and preferred to meet it early. By the time Samuel set his items on the counter, he felt almost normal. Megan rang them up without much conversation. "Need anything else?" she asked. "No," Samuel said. "That should do it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket for the receipt envelope. The fabric caught. The envelope bent. One wrapped money bundle slipped free, struck the edge of the counter, and dropped to the floor with a dull, unmistakable weight. The sound was small. The silence afterward was not. Megan froze. The two men in the back looked over at once. Samuel bent instinctively, but the shorter man took a step backward before he even touched the floor, suspicion already hardening his face. The taller one did not move, though his eyes narrowed. Megan's hand disappeared beneath the counter, hovering near the phone. Samuel felt the old humiliation hit before he had fully straightened. It was not really about the money. It was about being seen through the worst possible lens before any explanation had a chance to breathe. He knew what they saw. Rough jacket, tired face, too much cash wrapped the wrong way. A man out of place. "I'm paying for the supplies," he said, but the sentence sounded thin, even to him. Megan swallowed. "Sir, I just need—" "This man does not need the police," a woman's voice said from behind him. "He needs to finish buying what he came for." Everyone turned. The speaker stood 2 places back in line, holding a basket with furnace filters and boat soap tucked against her side. She was a small, elderly woman, narrow through the shoulders but straight in posture, with white hair cut neatly to the jaw and tucked beneath a dark wool hat. Her face was lined in a fine, careful way, not fragile, but weathered by long years of carrying herself through difficulty without surrendering to it. Her coat was camel-colored and well-woolled, and her blue-gray eyes had the kind of steadiness that made other people hear themselves more clearly. She stepped forward, bent without fuss, and picked up the fallen bundle before placing it on the counter beside Samuel's list. Her gaze dropped to the edge of his wallet, where an old military ID card had shifted partly free. Then she looked at his face. "What's your name?" she asked. "Samuel Reed." "You served?" He hesitated only a moment. "Army." The woman nodded once. "My husband was Air Force. Harold Bennett was Navy. Between the 3 of you, that makes enough stubbornness to sink this whole store." The line was dry enough to catch the taller customer off guard. He looked away first. Samuel stared at her. "You knew Harold?" "Long enough to know when he was pretending he didn't need anyone." She set her basket down on the counter. "I'm Eleanor Pike." The name meant nothing to Samuel yet, but she continued before he had to answer. "My husband, Thomas, and Harold spent a year stationed in the Gulf at the same time. Different branches, same bad weather, same war, same habit of coming home quieter than they left." Her voice softened at the edges, but never lost its shape. "Harold used to bring my husband spare parts when money was tight, refused to call it help, said it was doc arithmetic." The room changed, not all at once, but enough. Megan's hand eased away from the phone. The shorter customer stopped staring at Samuel and began staring instead at his own boots, embarrassed by the speed of his conclusion. Eleanor noticed none of it, or pretended not to. She simply looked at Megan and said, "Ring him up." Megan nodded and resumed. Samuel found his voice a moment later. I can pay. I believe that, Eleanor said. That isn't the problem. There was no pity in her tone, only precision. Megan gave the total. Samuel counted again, slower this time, heat rising in his face despite the cold draft near the door. He came up short by a few dollars after tax. Before he could set anything aside, Eleanor laid the difference on the counter with a gloved hand. Please, Samuel began. Don't waste the old man's gift on embarrassment, she said quietly, low enough that only Samuel could hear. Harold did not save all those years so the right person could turn small because a room got awkward. Samuel looked at her sharply. Eleanor held his gaze. I know that look, she said, and I know Harold, or knew him well enough to recognize one of his decisions after he was gone. Cooper came and stood beside Samuel, pressing lightly against his leg. Eleanor glanced down at the dog, and something gentler moved across her face. Thomas had a shepherd too, after the war. Smart dog. Knew when not to ask questions. Samuel swallowed once. Thank you. She gave the faintest nod. Then do something useful with the chance. He carried the supplies to the truck in 2 trips. Cooper stayed close both times, never pulling ahead, never lagging. When Samuel climbed into the driver's seat at last, he did not start the engine immediately. Through the store window, he could see Eleanor still at the counter, speaking to Megan in the calm, matter-of-fact way of someone who had spent years teaching rooms how not to become cruel. For a long moment, Samuel sat with both hands on the wheel. He had spent years believing life after war was mostly a series of closed doors. Some slammed, some quietly shut, some never opened at all. Yet here he was, holding a receipt for paint and sealant and basic repairs, with Cooper in the passenger seat and a dead sailor's trust hidden beneath the floor of a houseboat. And now, somehow, an old widow had stepped out of an ordinary line at an ordinary store and made the world feel less narrow than it had an hour earlier. Money had not repaired him. It had not stopped the night from coming. It had not erased fear, shame, or the reflex to expect the worst from a room full of strangers. But before he turned the key in the ignition, Samuel let himself admit one thing. For the first time in a long while, life no longer felt like nothing but doors closing. By the first week of February, Samuel Reed had fallen into a rhythm, strong enough to carry him through the cold. He no longer measured his days by what he had lost, or what might go wrong next. He measured them by tasks, morning coffee, day labor, if he could get it, an hour at the library when time allowed, then the boat, always the boat, waiting for him at the dock with its rust, its weak seams, its dead engine, and its stubborn refusal to disappear. Winter still held the river hard, but not silent. Snow came and went in light, persistent flurries, whitening the dock rails and the roof of the cabin by dawn, then thinning again by afternoon. The houseboat remained tied in the same slip, but it had already begun to look less abandoned. A pane near the table had been replaced. The worst of the soft floor near the sink was gone. The patched roof no longer let cold water creep down the wall when snow melted. Buckets of rust flakes and old nails sat stacked near the dock, like evidence of a quieter kind of battle. Samuel started each morning the same way. He heated water on the camp burner, drank coffee standing by the small window, and wrote a list in Harold Bennett's old notebook. Never on the pages Harold had used, only in the blank pages at the back. Check port side seam. Measure the fuel housing, find correct fasteners, replace cracked gasket, strip rust from the railing base. He kept the lists practical and short. Long lists gave fear too much room. Then he worked. If Rick Halverson had something at the marina, Samuel took it. If Rick did not, Samuel found other work around town, hauling feed sacks, unloading fencing wire, carrying bundled shingles into a warehouse, breaking down shipping pallets behind a hardware store. He said little, lifted what needed lifting, and left when the work was done. The town still did not know what to make of him, but it had begun to understand that he was not a man waiting to be rescued. He was a man already in motion. What money he used on the boat, he used carefully. He bought what he needed and almost nothing more. No one looking at the old houseboat from a distance would have guessed that there was hidden money beneath its floorboards. That mattered to him. Harold had not left him comfort. He had left him a chance to work without fear of immediate ruin, and Samuel meant to honor the difference. On the days when he could spare an hour, he went to the public library. The library sat on a side street behind the post office, a low brick building with fogged windows and a heater that hummed louder than some of the patrons. Samuel had not used a library in years, but now he moved through it with increasing purpose. Peter Nolan, the librarian, had grown used to seeing him at the back table by the repair manuals. Peter was a narrow, sandy-haired man in his late 40s, with wire-framed glasses and the careful quiet of someone who had learned to help without crowding. His shirts were always buttoned too high, and he moved with a slight forward lean, as if listening even when no one had spoken. "You're back to the diesel books," Peter said one afternoon, setting down a thicker manual with a blue cloth cover. Samuel glanced up. "Need to understand old injection systems better." Peter nodded. "This one's ugly, but honest." That turned out to be true of the book. It was dense and plain and full of diagrams drawn by men who assumed the reader was capable of patience. Samuel copied notes by hand: fuel order, return line routing, compression sequence, wiring color codes, starter relay failure patterns. He drew arrows in the margins of his paper and wrote reminders to himself in block letters. If he could not yet repair the engine by instinct, he could at least learn how not to lie to himself about what he did not know. At night, under the weak cabin light, he applied what he had learned. He scraped rust until his gloves thinned at the fingertips. He removed cracked sealant around the windows and laid new lines with steadier hands each week. He measured boards twice before cutting once. He cleaned engine parts one at a time on an old rag spread over the table, careful not to scatter bolts or forget sequence. Cooper moved around him like a quiet witness, sometimes dozing near the chair, sometimes sitting by the open engine housing, as if listening for the moment when metal might begin to remember itself. The people near the marina began noticing in the way people usually do when a man keeps showing up long enough to become part of the landscape. Ada Mercer was the first to cross the line from watching to helping. She lived 2 slips down in a low river house on pilings, the sort of place that had once belonged to fishermen and now belonged mostly to widows, weather, and routine. Ada was well into her 70s, short and broad through the shoulders, with thick white hair pinned up loosely and cheeks permanently flushed by the cold. She had the hands of a person who had worked all her life and saw no reason to apologize for it. Her husband had run a bait trawler until a stroke ended his work, and then, a few years later, his life. Since then, Ada had developed a habit of speaking plainly and feeding people before they were foolish enough to admit hunger. The first time she knocked on Samuel's cabin door, she was holding a mason jar wrapped in a dish towel. "Soup," she said. "Don't make me stand out here explaining vegetables." Samuel took the jar. "You don't have to keep doing this." Ada sniffed. "Good thing I didn't ask permission." Cooper appeared behind Samuel, sat down, and looked at the jar with practiced interest. Ada noticed him. "That one has excellent judgment. Better than yours, probably." After that, she came by once or twice a week, never lingering too long, never making kindness feel like pity. Sometimes it was soup, sometimes cornbread wrapped in foil. Once it was a pair of wool socks left on the rail with no note at all. Others helped in quieter ways. Vernon Shaw, who ran the salvage yard outside town, began setting useful parts aside for Samuel. Vernon was a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and a permanent stiffness in one knee from an old logging accident. He haggled as a matter of principle and trusted almost no one at first meeting, but he respected 2 things deeply: tools that still worked and people who did not whine while using them. "Got some marine-grade bolts in a coffee tin," Vernon muttered one afternoon, sliding the box across the counter. "Not pretty, but stronger than half the new junk." When Samuel asked the price, Vernon named a number so low it was almost an insult, then grumbled until Samuel paid it. The engine, though, remained the true divide between making the boat livable and making it alive. It sat beneath its metal housing like an old animal that had survived by refusing to die and now refused to rise. Samuel studied it by lamplight, then by flashlight, then by the weak gray of morning, whenever he could not bear one more hour indoors. He cleaned the housing, traced the lines, changed the filters, tested the battery cables, and replaced what he knew was dead. The manuals helped, but only to a point. The diagrams had been made for engines still young enough to obey. This one had its own history, layered over every diagram. That was when Frank Dugan began appearing often enough to matter. Frank did not introduce himself right away. For several Saturdays, he merely showed up on the dock and stood with his hands in the pockets of an old field coat, watching Samuel work. He was in his late 60s, tall but slightly bent through one shoulder, with a close white beard, a badly reset nose, and deep-set eyes that made his silences feel intentional rather than empty. One leg dragged a fraction behind the other when he walked, an old injury Rick later said came from a bridge collapse overseas when Frank was still with the Army engineers. He was not rude. He was simply a man who had long ago decided talk should earn its place. On the fourth Saturday, after watching Samuel prime the old diesel for the better part of 10 minutes, Frank finally stepped closer and said, "You're making it harder than it has to be." Samuel straightened, rag in hand. "That's so." Frank nodded toward the line assembly. "Feed and return are swapped in your sequence, not in the diagram. In your hands." Samuel frowned and looked down. Frank crouched with a quiet grunt, tapped 2 metal lines with one finger, and rearranged them by explanation rather than touch. "This old thing's been worked on before. Diagram won't save you if some fool changed the order 20 years ago." Samuel stared a moment longer, then gave one short nod. "You know engines. Enough to dislike them honestly." That was as close to friendship as Frank came on the first day. After that, he started showing up every weekend. He taught the way some men chop wood, efficiently, with no wasted movement and little concern for bruised pride. He showed Samuel how to bleed the fuel lines properly, how to listen for compression loss instead of guessing at it, how to clean terminals without ruining the connection, how to trust a sound over a diagram when an old machine had lived too long in amateur hands. Samuel learned quickly, partly because he was capable, and partly because he had become hungry for the kind of knowledge that came from weathered hands rather than books. Cooper accepted Frank almost immediately, which saved time. The dog sniffed him once, decided he belonged, and thereafter lay near the engine housing during their work sessions, occasionally opening one eye as if supervising the lesson. By the end of the month, the houseboat had changed in ways large enough for even strangers to see. The port side rust had been cut back and treated. The worst seams were sealed, the patched cabin windows held, the floor near the sink felt firm underfoot. Tools had places now. So did manuals, rags, spare bolts, primer cans, and parts waiting for their turn. The boat still looked old. That was not the point. It no longer looked as though it had given up. The engine was the last great test. On a bright, bitter Saturday, several people happened to be nearby without quite meaning to be. Ada came carrying biscuits wrapped in a towel. Vernon leaned against the railing with a mug in his hand. Rick paused on his way down the dock and stayed. Frank crouched by the open housing, while Samuel checked the lines one final time. "Don't rush it," Frank said. "I'm not." Frank gave him a look that suggested history disagreed. Samuel adjusted the choke, primed the system, checked the switch, and turned the key. The engine answered with a single dead click. His stomach tightened. Frank did not move. Again, slower. Samuel waited, breathed once, reset, and turned the key a second time. This time the starter dragged, coughed, and almost failed. Then something deeper caught. The engine shuddered once, spat a burst of smoke, and fell into an ugly, uneven roar that shook the whole cabin. The boat trembled under Samuel's boots, metal rattled, the exhaust coughed again. And then, against every week of silence before it, the sound settled into a rough but living rhythm. For 1 second Samuel only stared. Then the force of it hit him all at once, not as triumph exactly, but as release. Months of cold, fear, labor, caution, and effort broke in one place behind his eyes. He turned partly away and wiped at his face with the heel of his hand, but he was too late to hide it. Cooper erupted into motion, barking in sharp, joyful bursts and racing the length of the deck before circling back again, nails skittering on the boards. Ada laughed out loud, real and warm. Vernon lifted his mug in approval. Rick grinned without restraint. Frank, still crouched by the housing, only nodded once and said, "There, she's breathing now." Samuel stood with one hand on the cabin wall, tears cold on his face, the engine's vibration coming through the wood and into his palm like a pulse. For the first time since the houseboat became his, it no longer felt like something merely staying alive. It felt like something beginning. Samuel Reed did not choose the boat's new name quickly. For 3 days after the engine came back to life, he worked around the stern with a scraper and sandpaper, taking off the last broken traces of the old lettering without replacing them. He wanted the right name to come from use, not sentiment. The boat had already been many things in a short time: a hiding place, a workshop, a memory box, an inheritance, a responsibility. But none of those were names. On the 4th morning, while Cooper stood on the dock, with snow gathering lightly across his back, Samuel finally painted the words in clean white block letters across the stern: Harbor Light. He stood back when he finished and looked at it in silence. The name did not feel clever. That mattered. It felt plain enough to be true. Ada Mercer saw it first. She came down the dock carrying a cloth bag of onions and potatoes and stopped 2 slips away, squinting through the cold. "Well," she called, "that's either a promise or a burden." Samuel looked over his shoulder. Maybe both. Ada came closer, boots tapping the boards, and studied the painted letters with her hands planted firmly in the pockets of her coat. "People see a thing called Harbor Light," she said. "They'll start believing they're allowed to head toward it." Samuel rested the brush across an empty paint can. "That may be the point." Ada gave him one long look, then nodded once and moved on without another word. But the sentence stayed with him all day. The idea had already been building before that. It lived in pieces at first. The row of tents under the overpass that he passed on his way into town. The 2 men he had seen warming their hands over a barrel behind the feed mill. The woman outside the bus station once, trying to wrap a child in a coat too small for both of them. The old reflex in him had always been to look without lingering. Not because he did not care, but because it took so little for recognition to become fear. Now he could not make himself turn away so quickly. He knew how cold seeped into a body after dark. He knew how hunger changed a man's voice. He knew the silence of people who had spent too much time being watched and weighed by strangers. Harold had left him a boat that could move. That fact began pressing against him until it became a question. What good was a repaired engine if it only proved he could leave? By Saturday morning, the question had become work. Samuel loaded Harbor Light with what he could carry and what others, without fanfare, had begun to add. Ada sent 2 stock pots of thick bean soup with smoked ham and carrots, packed hot and wrapped in old towels. Eleanor Pike delivered ground coffee in a metal tin and a stack of paper cups, along with a note in her narrow, precise handwriting: "Hot things matter more than speeches." Rick left 3 heavy marina blankets folded near the gangplank with no comment. Vernon Shaw had, the day before, sold Samuel a crate of wool caps and gloves for less than they were worth, and then complained the entire time as if generosity would rot his teeth. Samuel arranged everything carefully in the cabin, pots wedged so they would not tip, cups tied in bundles, blankets stacked near the door, one flashlight by the wheelhouse, another by the entry. He moved with the focus of a man preparing for weather, more than charity. He had no intention of delivering pity to anyone. Pity had a smell people recognized too quickly. What he wanted to bring was simpler: heat, food, and a place where no one had to explain themselves before being allowed to take either. Cooper seemed to understand before Samuel spoke a word. The German shepherd paced the deck once while the supplies were being loaded, then stationed himself near the gangplank, ears forward, watching each new item come aboard as though inventory mattered to him too. When Samuel finally untied the lines and eased Harbor Light away from the slip, Cooper took his place near the bow without drama, balanced and alert, the cold air lifting the fur at his neck. The river was calm but not still. A light current carried them south along the tree-lined bank, past half-frozen reeds and the backs of warehouses that looked lonelier from the water than they ever did from the road. The engine remained rough at low speed, but it held. Samuel kept both hands near the wheel more often than he needed to, listening to the sound beneath his feet and feeling each vibration through the deck. He had not steered anything larger than a borrowed John boat in years. Even so, the motion came back quicker than he expected. Not skill exactly, more like memory. Their first stop was the overpass. From the river, the encampment looked smaller and more exposed than it did from the road. Blue tarps were tied between concrete supports and bare-limbed trees. Shopping carts stood at odd angles near the bank. A burn barrel smoked near the center of the camp, its fire low and practical. 3 people were already watching by the time Samuel cut the engine and nudged Harbor Light close enough to set the gangplank down. Cooper stepped off first. He did not bound forward. He did not bark. He walked to the end of the plank, paused, and stood there with his head level, letting the people on shore decide what sort of dog he was. That was often all it took. Men suspicious of help still trusted a dog to mean what he looked like he meant. The first one to approach was Leon Walker. Leon was older than Samuel by at least 15 years, maybe more, though hardship had a way of confusing ages. He wore an army field coat faded almost gray at the seams and kept his black and silver beard trimmed close in a manner that suggested old habits had outlasted easier living. His shoulders curved slightly forward, not from weakness, but from too many winters meeting cold head-on. His face was narrow, deeply lined around the mouth, and his eyes had the watchfulness of a man who had not survived by trusting first. "That your boat?" Leon asked. Samuel nodded. "Mine." "And the dog?" "Also mine." Cooper walked forward then, sniffed once at Leon's gloved hand, and rested his head lightly against the man's knee. Leon went still for a beat. Then he scratched behind the dog's ear with a hand that was steadier than his first question had sounded. "Well," he said quietly, "that saves us half the conversation." The others came closer after that. One was a woman named Tessa Boone, no older than 30, with dark curly hair twisted into a tired knot and sharp, watchful eyes that seemed to count exits before people. She wore 2 sweaters under a man's coat that hung too large at the shoulders and kept one arm protectively around a thin boy beside her. The boy, Milo, looked about 12 and had the narrow face and guarded stillness of a child who had learned to keep his feelings folded inward where weather and adults could not reach them easily. Samuel did not ask why they were there. He handed Tessa a blanket first, then a cup of soup, then one for Milo. "No forms?" she asked, suspicious of the simplicity. "No forms." "No church pamphlet?" Samuel almost smiled. "No pamphlet." Tessa looked at the cup in her hands as if it might still hide a condition somewhere in the steam, then nodded once. "All right." More people emerged slowly after that, drawn less by Samuel than by the smell of hot broth and coffee. A gaunt man with 2 coats layered under a fishing slicker, a woman with swollen knuckles and a cough that sounded older than she was, a young veteran named Eddie Morales who hovered back at first, compact and rigid, his shaved head gleaming pale in the weak light. A scar cut through one eyebrow and disappeared into his temple. He accepted coffee without meeting Samuel's eyes, but Cooper approached him anyway, leaned once against his leg, and stayed there until some of the stiffness left his jaw. Samuel understood then that the dog was doing the work he himself could not have done with words. That first trip did not last long, an hour, maybe a little more. Enough for cups to empty and hands to warm. Enough for names to settle in his memory. Enough for Leon to ask before Samuel pushed off again. "You coming back next week?" Samuel looked at Harbor Light, then at the people near the barrel, then at Cooper standing halfway up the plank waiting for him. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." He did return the next week, and the one after that. Each trip added something. More soup from Ada, extra gloves and wool socks from Vernon, coffee from Eleanor. Quiet approval from Rick, who started pretending not to notice when Samuel borrowed spare fuel from the marina tank and replaced it the following Monday with cash on the office desk. Peter Nolan from the library came once carrying a box of old paperbacks and magazines tied with string. He stood awkwardly on the dock until Samuel invited him aboard, at which point he looked relieved enough to be useful. The people at the overpass changed too, though not all at once. Leon began helping unload the pots before anyone asked him to. Tessa stopped holding Milo so tightly when Harbor Light approached. Eddie came closer each week until he finally stepped onto the deck one afternoon and spent 20 silent minutes helping Samuel coil rope after the coffee ran out. Ruth Ann Cobble, a thin woman in her late 50s, with tobacco-brown skin, quick hands, and the practical authority of someone who had worked kitchens her entire life, took one look at the way Samuel stored his spoons and announced he needed supervision. The next Saturday, she came back with dish towels and began reorganizing the cabin shelves, as if Harbor Light had hired her formally. No one laughed at her. It worked too well. That was how Harbor Light began to change from a boat that brought supplies into a place people quietly started returning to. Not everyone came aboard. Not everyone needed to. The point was not to gather crowds. The point was to remove one layer of humiliation from being cold, or hungry, or tired of hearing your own thoughts. On Harbor Light, no one had to explain how they got there before being handed soup. No one had to dress their pain in a version acceptable to decent society. Veterans spoke if they wanted to. They stayed silent if they did not. Samuel found that he could stand in those silences without rushing to fix them, because he knew their shape. One evening, after the last cups had been stacked and the light was draining from the river, Leon stood on the stern beside the fresh white letters. "Harbor Light," he said, reading it aloud as if testing the truth of it. "You named her right." Samuel leaned on the rail beside him. The engine ticked softly as it cooled beneath them. Cooper sat nearby, facing shore. Leon kept looking at the name. "Places like this don't heal a man all at once," he said, "but they can keep him from going under while he's trying to heal himself." Samuel said nothing at first. He looked back toward the cabin. The patched windows, the old chair, the table scarred by age and now by use, the shelf Ruth Ann had reorganized. The stockpot Ada insisted was hers and would remain hers no matter what happened to the boat. Then he looked toward shore, where Tessa was wrapping Milo in one of the marina blankets, and Eddie was standing close enough to the fire barrel that he no longer looked prepared to bolt. Harbor Light had started moving the day Samuel first turned the key and heard the engine answer, but only now did he understand what it had been moving toward. By the middle of March, Samuel Reed had stopped being unusual at the marina. That was its own kind of change. People no longer looked twice when they saw him crossing the dock at dawn, with a toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other. Harbor Light no longer seemed like a strange experiment tied to the far slip. It had become part of the place, and so had he. The offer came on a Thursday. Samuel had just finished helping Rick Halverson replace a failing heater in the marina office, when Rick stood back, rubbed one large hand over his beard, and said, "Morris could use a man." Samuel kept tightening the final screw. "For what?" "For work," Rick said, as if that should have been enough explanation. "He's short-handed. Frank says you learn fast. I say you show up. Around here, those are better references than charm." Samuel looked up then. Rick was not a man who dressed favors in sentiment. If he was mentioning Samuel's name to someone else, he had already decided the matter was serious. "Who's Morris?" Samuel asked. "Halberd Mechanical, shot by the freight yard. He fixes heaters, generators, engines, whatever people bring him when they've already made a mess of it." Rick folded his arms. "Go tomorrow, 7 o'clock. He'll know why you're there." Samuel nodded once. "All right." The shop sat behind the freight yard in a long metal building the color of old smoke, with a roll-up door at one end and 3 dented service trucks parked along the side. Inside, the air was warm in places and cold in others, depending on what machine had been running recently. The smell was oil, metal dust, scorched wiring, stale coffee, and work done close to the hands. Samuel liked it immediately, though he did not show that. Morris Halberd stood near a workbench sorting brass fittings into coffee cans labeled by size. He was a big man in his late 50s, thick through the chest and neck, with iron gray hair cropped short and a beard trimmed blunt along a square jaw. His hands looked like they belonged to a blacksmith rather than a mechanic. He had the habit of studying a machine first and a person second, as if equipment had earned the right to his attention more consistently than people had. "So, you're Reed," he said. Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." Morris grunted. "Frank says you don't panic around old metal. Rick says you come back the next day. That's enough for me to talk to you." That was as close to welcome as Morris likely gave anyone. He walked Samuel through the shop without ceremony. The first mechanic he met was Caleb Mercer, Ada's grandson, though the resemblance showed more in the eyes than the frame. Caleb was 32, broad-shouldered, loose-limbed, with dark curls shoved under a knit cap and a permanent shadow of grease at one wrist no soap ever seemed to remove. He had the easy posture of someone naturally good with machines and not threatened by other people learning. His grin came quickly, his patience even quicker. The second was Mina Lopez, who handled parts orders, invoices, customer calls, and, by the look of things, every practical problem Morris preferred to ignore until it grew teeth. Mina was in her early 40s, slim and sharp-featured, with dark hair braided down her back and eyes that missed very little. She dressed plainly, moved briskly, and had the clipped efficiency of someone who had spent years keeping men from confusing activity with competence. There was nothing soft in the way she spoke, but nothing cruel in it either. She simply had no room for waste. Morris handed Samuel a broom first. That, too, mattered. No speech about second chances, no dramatic apprenticeship, just work. Sweep the back bay, sort the salvageable cords from the dead ones, drain the old generator casing, label the working heaters, carry the busted units to the side wall. By lunchtime, Samuel understood what Morris was testing. Not skill first, temperament. Whether Samuel would do necessary work well before asking for meaningful work. He would. The next day, Mina showed him how the parts shelves were arranged, and watched long enough to see that he remembered the system after one explanation. Caleb showed him how the shop tested heater igniters and generator output under load. Morris let him listen more than touch for the first week. By the second week, Samuel was cleaning and reassembling small components. By the third, he was handling simple jobs under Caleb's eye. "Don't force threads because you're in a hurry," Caleb told him one afternoon, watching Samuel reseat a small housing on a portable heater. "I'm not in a hurry." "Good," Caleb said. "Then keep it that way. Rushed men make expensive mistakes." The rhythm suited Samuel. Mornings began earlier now. He still lived on Harbor Light, still woke with the river beneath him, and Cooper near the bunk, but instead of drifting into day labor, he walked into the shop with a purpose waiting for him. It was not glamorous work. He swept, sorted, cleaned, labeled, drained, tested, and carried. Yet even that felt different from the patchwork jobs of winter, because it was connected. One task led to another. One skill built on the last. At the end of a day, there was evidence of progress in the form of quiet machines and completed tickets. Trust came the way it usually did in places like that, through repetition more than praise. A generator needed a carburetor cleaned and recalibrated. Morris let Samuel do the disassembly. A heater came in with a failed ignition module. Caleb let Samuel trace the fault. A small outboard engine belonging to a man from the south slips coughed itself dead in the back bay. Frank happened to be there on a Saturday, watched Samuel test the fuel flow, and only said, "Go on," when Samuel looked up for confirmation. Soon customers began hearing Morris say things like, "Reed handled that one," or "Leave the heater, he'll get to it Monday." The sentences were plain. Samuel carried them home like medals anyway. The gatherings at the church came from Harbor Light more than from any plan. By April, some of the people Samuel met on the weekend river runs had started lingering at the marina after unloading supplies or helping clean up. Leon would stand by the rail with coffee long after the stock pots were washed. Eddie sometimes stayed to coil rope in silence. Ruth Ann had strong opinions about every shelf in the cabin and offered them freely. They were not looking for appointments or counseling. They were looking for somewhere to stay human for an hour. Margaret Collins saw it before Samuel named it. One Wednesday evening, after Samuel helped her carry folding chairs from a closet into the fellowship hall, she asked, "If I put on coffee and leave the side door open, would they come?" Samuel set down the chairs and thought about Leon's dry stillness, Eddie's guarded posture, Ruth Ann's clipped humor, the way Harbor Light made space without making demands. "They might," he said. Margaret nodded. "Good. Then we won't call it anything." That became the rule from the beginning. No name, no program, no official language, just coffee, folding chairs, cookies if someone remembered, and a room warm enough for people to unclench in. The church hall was plain, linoleum floor, scuffed tables, an old upright piano no one touched, yellow light too soft to flatter anything. But it was dry, heated, and private, which in that season of their lives counted for almost everything. The first night, only 4 people came. Leon came because Samuel asked. Eddie came because Leon did. Ruth Ann came because she announced someone had to make sure Church Coffee had not committed a crime against beans. And Daniel Kerr came because he saw the side door open and almost kept walking. Daniel was 52, tall in the way some men stay tall even after life bends them inward. He had short brown hair turning silver at the temples, a clean but tired face, and the lingering physical discipline of a man who had once expected much more from himself than the world currently did. He had served in the National Guard, worked logistics after that, lost the marriage slowly, then the job quickly, and now lived in a van that still smelled faintly of copier paper and old raincoats. He spoke with the caution of someone embarrassed by how much had unraveled. The first half hour passed mostly in practical talk: weather, fuel prices, a broken overpass light, the quality of Ada's soup versus Ruth Ann's standards, which no one could meet because Ruth Ann had worked kitchens for 30 years and believed every recipe in America lacked courage. Then the room settled, not awkwardly, truthfully. Cooper crossed from chair to chair and finally sat beside Daniel, resting one flank against his leg. Daniel put one hand on the dog's back and kept it there. "I keep waiting to feel like the man who came back," he said at last, staring into his coffee. "But maybe the one who came back is the problem." Nobody rushed to answer. That was one of the reasons the room worked. Silence did not have to be rescued from itself. Finally, Samuel said, "Maybe he just needs different work." Daniel looked up. What if he doesn't know what that is? Samuel thought of Harbor Light, of the shop, of the church hall, of the old chest under the floorboards, and the life hidden inside it. "Then he keeps showing up," Samuel said, "until something starts answering back." The room stayed quiet after that, but it was a better quiet. The weeks took shape around those evenings. Samuel worked full days at Halberd Mechanical and spent his nights on Harbor Light or in the church hall. Caleb began trusting him with more complex repairs. Mina left invoices on his bench with brief notes like, "Customer says he already tried fixing it. Assume this means he broke something important." Morris stopped watching every move Samuel made and started handing him work orders without explanation, which in that shop meant the same thing as confidence. Meanwhile, the Wednesday gatherings grew by one person here, 2 there, a widower who had not spoken to anyone outside the grocery store in months, a woman whose son was deployed overseas and whose nights had become too long, a younger veteran who never said much at all, but always came if Leon was there. No one asked what brought anyone in. No one had to. Samuel found that he was good at many things he had once thought were gone from him. He could listen without rushing. He could make coffee strong enough to please Ruth Ann, which was nearly a credential. He could see when Eddie needed a job, not a question. He could tell when Daniel was about to leave too early and when to let Cooper block the doorway by accident on purpose. And as the weeks passed, something inside Samuel changed in a way more difficult to measure than repaired engines or paid invoices. He still had hard nights. He still woke too fast sometimes. But his mind no longer had the same empty hours to circle itself to death. Work claimed part of him. Usefulness claimed another. The rest, the darker part that had once spread through whole days without resistance, now met other presences on its way forward. Cooper's wait at the foot of the bunk, Morris calling from across the shop, Margaret setting out cups, Leon leaning in the church doorway, Ada knocking once and entering anyway. One Wednesday night, long after the others had gone, Samuel was stacking folding chairs while Cooper nosed for crumbs under the tables. Margaret stood by the light switch with her coat half buttoned and watched him for a moment. "You look different," she said. Samuel set another chair against the wall. "How?" "Occupied," Margaret said. "In the healthiest sense." He considered that. "That good?" "For men like you," she said. Purpose is sometimes the first argument that pain loses. She switched off the hall lights then, leaving only the low glow from the vestibule. Samuel looked around the dim room, the coffee urn, The empty chairs, the crumbs Ruth Ann would complain about next time, Cooper's shadow moving beside his own. There was still work to do. That had once sounded like a sentence. Now it sounded like a life. By the following spring, Harbor Light no longer looked like a boat someone had nearly given up on. She still showed her years honestly. The patched seams, the weathered rail, the boards that had known too many winters to pretend otherwise. But nothing about her suggested abandonment anymore. The hull held its color. The windows glowed warm in the evening. The cabin light came on at dusk often enough, now that people at the marina had started glancing toward Slip 9, the way people glance toward a porch where they know someone will answer the door. The gathering happened on a mild Saturday in late April. It was not a festival, no banners, no speeches planned in advance, no polished ceremony. Just folding tables on the dock, borrowed chairs, 2 crock pots plugged into an extension cord, run carefully from the marina office, and enough people showing up with dishes, paper cups, and reasons to stay that the whole thing became something larger than anyone had officially intended. Ada Mercer arrived first, with potato salad and baked beans packed into old glass bowls wrapped in kitchen towels. She moved with the same compact authority she brought to every useful thing in life, white hair pinned up roughly, cheeks flushed by the river wind, thick hands steady around hot dishes. Vernon Shaw came next carrying a cooler in one hand and pretending he was only there to return a borrowed wrench. Caleb and Mina strung a line of small yellow bulbs along the railing because Mina refused to let the dock look. In her words, like gratitude was an afterthought. Morris Halbert appeared late, as if he wanted it understood that work had delayed him and not sentiment, but he came all the same. Margaret Collins brought cookies from the church kitchen, and Peter Nolan arrived with a cardboard box of old books someone had donated for the church hall. By noon, the dock was full of the sort of people who would not have called themselves a community a year earlier, but had become one anyway. Leon Walker stood near the stern with coffee in both hands. 1 cup meant for Daniel Kerr, who was still talking with Eddie near the gangplank. Tessa Boone kept an eye on Milo while pretending she was not watching him smile at something Caleb had said. Ruth Ann Cobble had already reorganized the serving table twice and was threatening a third correction if anyone put the spoons back in the wrong cup. Rick Halverson moved from group to group with the harried expression of a man who had started a small thing and found out too late that people meant more by it than he had planned for. Cooper moved through it all like he belonged to every part of it. Children from the church scratched behind his ears. Leon patted his shoulder when he passed. Ruth Ann gave him 2 biscuit pieces and denied it when accused. Around his neck was a new leather collar, dark brown and simple, with a brass plate that caught the afternoon light each time he turned his head. Samuel crouched to read it. Good boy, good work. For a second he just stared. Then he rubbed one hand slowly over Cooper's neck and gave a small laugh through his nose, the kind that came from being moved too suddenly to answer any better than that. Margaret stood nearby, pleased, but pretending not to be. The church voted, she said. Unanimous. Of course they did, Ada called from the table. He's the only one around here who knows when to sit down and listen. That earned a wave of quiet laughter from the dock. Samuel stood, still one hand on Cooper's back, and looked around at all of them. He had never wanted to become the center of anything. Even now, with the afternoon sun on the river and voices drifting warmly around him, part of him wanted to move sideways out of the frame and let the gathering belong to everyone else instead. In truth, it did belong to everyone else too. Harbor Light had not become what she was because of one pair of hands alone, but sometimes a man had to stand still long enough to let kindness land where it was aimed. That was when Rick cleared his throat and stepped up onto the low wooden platform outside the marina office. He did not look comfortable there. His shoulders seemed broader than usual, his gray beard roughened by a nervous pass of one hand. He glanced once at Samuel, once at Harbor Light, then addressed the group without preamble. This slip, he said, jerking his thumb toward the boat, is Harbor Light's as long as Samuel wants it. The dock went quiet enough that the river could be heard under the boards. Rick kept going before anyone could interrupt him. No more monthly fee, no more paperwork headache. She's got a long-term berth here, settled. Applause broke out before Samuel could say a word. Ada started it. Ruth Ann followed. Caleb whistled through 2 fingers. Even Morris clapped once, heavily, as though it were a tool he did not use often but knew the purpose of. Samuel looked at Rick. "You don't have to do that." Rick looked back with the practical stubbornness Samuel had come to know too well. Already did. That was the end of the argument. The gift hit Samuel harder than he showed. A permanent berth was more than a saved expense. It meant Harbor Light no longer floated on borrowed time. It meant address, anchor, permission to remain. It meant one less thing in life that could be taken away by the month. Later, after plates had been filled and refilled, after coffee had been poured enough times that the second pot no longer tasted like the first, a retired electrician named Howard Bell asked the question Samuel had known someone eventually would. Howard was a narrow, stooped man in his 70s with deep folds at the corners of his mouth, and eyes that still narrowed automatically as if peering into harsh work lights. He had the cautious speech of a man who preferred clear answers to decorative ones. Standing near the rail with one hand resting on Harbor Light's side, he looked from Samuel to the hull and said, "If Harold Bennett had that kind of money, why didn't he fix this boat up proper while he was alive?" It was not a rude question. It was, in fact, the right one. Several conversations nearby quieted just enough to listen. Samuel rested one hand on the weathered rail before answering. "Because if she'd looked too good," he said, "someone would have tried to take her." Howard frowned slightly, not because he disagreed, but because he wanted the full thought. Samuel gave it to him. If Harold had made her gleam, if he'd hired too much work, shown too much money, or let the wrong people understand what she was worth, she would have stopped being a refuge. She would have become something people wanted a claim on. He looked at the old hull, the patched cabin, the fresh painted name on the stern. He didn't leave her ugly because he didn't care. He left her plain because plain things get left alone. The dock stayed quiet. Samuel spoke more softly then, almost as if he were speaking to Harold as much as to the people standing around him. She only had to do 3 things for him: keep out the rain, hold in enough heat, and listen. Howard let out a slow breath and nodded once. "That makes sense." "It does now," Samuel said. He might have left it there, but the truth had one more piece in it. "And maybe he was waiting," he added. "Not for someone rich, not for someone impressive, just for the right person to come along with enough need to understand what the boat was really for." No one rushed to answer that. They did not need to. As the afternoon leaned toward evening, the dock lights came on one by one. The little yellow bulbs Mina had insisted on stringing along the rail gave off a soft glow that reflected in broken lines across the river. Inside Harbor Light, the cabin lamp was turned on, spilling warm amber light through the windows. Coffee gave way to quieter conversation. People shifted from standing in groups to sitting wherever there was room, on folding chairs, on the edge of the dock, along the stern bench. Samuel moved between them all without hurry. Daniel asked Caleb something about generators and actually laughed at the answer. Tessa sat closer to the cabin than she used to, with Milo beside her and a church cookie in his hand. Eddie stood with Leon facing the dark river, and though neither said much, they no longer looked like men waiting to leave. Ruth Ann kept muttering about the spoons, which was her way of making sure no one drifted too far into solemnity. Margaret poured another round of coffee, and never once called attention to how many people had begun, over the last months, building pieces of their week around this place. When the gathering finally thinned and then dissolved, Samuel remained on deck with Cooper at his side. The dock was quiet again, but not empty in the old sense. There was a difference now. Empty used to mean forgotten. Tonight it meant finished for the day. Inside the cabin, the air still held the traces of people: coffee, soup, damp wool, dish soap, a little machine oil, the faint sweetness of church cookies. The table was marked with fresh rings from mugs. One extra chair sat crooked because Daniel had stood too quickly when saying goodbye. Cooper stepped inside first, then circled once near the old chair and lay down there with a long sigh, as though closing one shift and beginning another. Samuel stood in the middle of the room and let the silence settle. He thought of the man he had been when this began, sleeping in the truck behind the church, waking in pieces, measuring every day only by what he could endure. That man was not gone. He still lived somewhere in Samuel's body. PTSD had not vanished. Some nights still came wrong. Some sounds still reached old wiring before reason could catch up. Healing had not arrived as a clean line. It had come as interruption, as work, as routine, as people knocking, as coffee poured by someone else's hand, as a dog pressing close at the right moment, as a boat that moved from hiding one man's pain to holding many people's tiredness without judgment. The difference now was not that pain had disappeared. It was that pain no longer held the wheel alone. Samuel walked to the window and looked out at the dark river beyond the dock lights. Then he looked back at the cabin, the scarred table, the stacked mugs, the extra blankets, the books, the old chair, the lamp glow, the dog and his new collar. The boat had been repaired by tools and money, yes, but that was not what had brought her back to life. Laughter had done some of it. Late coffee had done some of it. Hands passing bowls and blankets had done some of it. People telling the truth in low voices had done some of it. And love, plain, practical, unadorned love, had done the rest. Samuel rested his hand on the back of the chair and said quietly to no one and to the whole room at once, "She has a soul." Cooper lifted his head but did not move. Samuel gave the dog a small, tired smile. And now she's saving people. Then he turned down the lamp to a softer glow, left one light burning in the cabin, and sat in the old chair while the river moved beneath him, and Harbor Light kept her warm yellow watch through the spring night. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come as a tired dog who stays, a broken boat that keeps floating, a warm meal shared in silence, or a stranger who chooses kindness when no one expects it. Samuel's story reminds us that God often works through simple things, through shelter, through honest work, through people who show up for one another when the world feels cold. No life is too far gone for purpose, and no heart is too broken to become a light for someone else. If this story touched you, share it with someone who may need hope today.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once feel forgotten.